The views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect the views or positions of any entities they represent, including OLAS Media.
OLAS Media.
You know, if we have, let's say we have a rape that happens today, a forcible rape of a child. We have that child or that victim go through a sexual assault examination. It's probably one of the most invasive, personally intrusive types of things we can expect somebody to go through. And that's because we have to collect the evidence. My view is, listen, you know, that rape happened today and they've developed a DNA profile, but they can't match it to anybody in the felon database. We should avail ourselves every single time of that tool if we're not able to solve it through traditional means.
This is a special simulcast presentation of Inside the Crime Files with Anne-Marie Schubert. On this simulcast episode of Inside the Crime Files, Anne-Marie Schubert appeared on the Nation State of Play podcast with Brian Miller. We'll join the interview with them as well as Brett Williams of Verigen, a California genetics firm that is taking forensic investigations further with next-generation sequencing solutions.
All right. Well, Brett and Anne-Marie, thank you both so much for being on the show today. I'm really excited to talk about this topic with the two of you.
Thanks for having us. Appreciate it.
You know, part of the reason I'm excited to have you here is we spent a lot of time on the show talking about the intersection of tech and public policy, and I can't think of a better example than Verigen and what you're doing in the law enforcement space, but also in broader context as well that I want to get into. And now that Anne-Marie is out of office, we're hoping we can get her to tell us some of the war stories about some amazing cases that she's worked on over the years, using this technology specifically. So we don't often have two guests on, but really excited to have the both of you on because I think it's a great way to talk about this from multiple perspectives. So before we dig into how it's used, Brett, could you give us a little bit of overview of the company and at a high level what you focus on?
Yes, certainly, Brian. So probably give you a little bit of history of the company. Verigen started out life as the forensic business of Illumina. And in August of 2017, it was spun out by Illumina. So we're a standalone company separate from Illumina. We're not controlled by Illumina. We're our own company. And since then, we've been building out focused on our mission and building out our ability to execute on that, which is we're a biometric-based human ID company. The ultimate biometric being DNA. That's unique to every one of us. At our core, we're a forensic focus, and we're using next-generation sequencing from Illumina. We have exclusive rights to their technology for forensics. And just to put that in context for everyone, Illumina, 90% of the human genome sequenced in the world today are performed on an Illumina platform. It is the gold standard from a sequencing platform perspective. We then leverage that technology to allow us to identify people. It's not about can I generate an STR profile or can I generate a SNP profile? This is about saying, who does that profile belong to? And we do that from a technology perspective. We generate the data from the next-gen sequencing platform we use from Illumina, but we then combine that with our GEDmatch database. And that's how we help law enforcement here, is by allowing access to the database combined with our technology, we can generate IDs for intractable cases out in the law enforcement sphere at the moment. Okay,
so and I just want to get the multiple applications out and then unpack these a little bit. So part of it is these cold cases in the law enforcement space. There's also a role, as I understand it, that has been used successfully for exonerating the wrongly convicted. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's not just a cold case technology. It's been used for resolving cold cases. Anne-Marie's, we'll talk more about that. But it also is used for unidentified human remains. It's also been used for exonerations. But one of the other uses where particularly ex-US is in conflict zones, identifying remains from conflict zone work is where we've got projects going now in Greece, Spain, the Korean and look in also discussions with the Vietnamese from the Vietnam War as well. It's surprising. There's 50, like for example, in Spain, there are 55,000 unidentified remains still. In Greece, it's from World War II where they have, and people are wanting to start to put an ID to these remains. And really, you can't do that any other way other than using the next-gen sequencing platform to do that. And so it's a very versatile, but it's also, as we said, it's 21st century technology being applied to the law enforcement sphere here.
So how far back historically, theoretically, could this technology be used to identify human remains?
So it's only going to be limited by the ability to identify relatives. So you've got to be, just like we identified, or Anne-Marie's team identified the Golden State Killer, you need to be able to use relatives to identify that person. So the longer you go, the less probability you'll have for identifying someone if there's no relatives around, right? You need some degree of relatives to be able to identify them. So, like for example, in the Korean War right now, that's 75 years ago. They're at second cousin level. But they have them. And so that's what they're doing. You've lost all of your first degree relatives by that stage. So STR profiling doesn't work. You have to go to SNP profiling. And that's where you can use more distant relatives to identify those remains. And so that's how it works.
I think a lot of people are somewhat familiar with this concept all of a sudden because of a Crown episode this season. I don't know if you guys have seen this episode about the Romanovs murder. Have either of you seen this?
No, I haven't actually.
No.
Okay. Well, I encourage you to check it out later. This is based on all true things that happened, but there's this terrible series of murders at the outset of World War
I.
World War I. Russian Tsar's family, and then there's bad blood between the Crown and Russia, and ultimately DNA technology was used through blood testing of Prince Philip's, I take it, to see if that was actually the remains that they'd identified. And so they kind of devoted a whole episode to it. So, hey, anything that brings science to a broader population, I'm all for. Okay, so I think we've got a sense of the broader applications. Who are your customers typically? Who is it that says, I need this, I'm going to buy the product?
So the actual purchasing is undertaken by the forensic laboratory, right? So the forensic DNA laboratory is our core customer who's going to buy our sequencing platform, the reagents. Our actual customer for the GEDmatch database is often the genealogist, right? Whether it be within law enforcement or if they've contracted out to a private genealogist, they're the folks that are going to be using the GEDmatch database. We also sell to the private labs, the private forensic labs, for example, Bodie Labs or DLI or DNA Labs International out in Florida. And to overseas, it's really to the same thing, very much government, academic. In Europe, for example, a lot of the forensic labs sit within universities. They call them Department of Legal Medicine. So for us, it's a variety, but mainly government, both state, local, and federal. Governments and private labs.
It's a great segue to talk about how Anne-Marie started to find out about this technology. So Anne-Marie, what was your first exposure to this concept? I think it's fairly early in your career, actually, you started getting interested in this.
Yeah, so I got my first DNA case in 1994. I was a younger prosecutor, I should say. And it was in the days of the first kind of introduction of DNA. If the world remembers, O.J. Simpson was kind of the big case that kind of exposed this new tool called DNA. My case involved a serial rapist. And that was, in the early days of DNA. And so it's one of those things that I've learned that, 25, 28 years ago, that DNA is the greatest tool ever to find the truth, no matter where it leads us. And so over time, I've had the benefit of kind of evolving with the science, as a prosecutor. And so then as time went on and DNA became more and more advanced, we started solving more and more cold cases. But, the cold case rate of solve is probably around 30% of cases or so. And then in the fall of 2017, while people were working feverishly to try to solve the Golden State Killer, a pretty smart investigator named Paul Holes came and asked me, "Hey, what do you think about this idea?" And he pitched it, and he kind of tried to explain this concept of what some people call genetic genealogy. We call forensic investigative genetic genealogy. And I remember sitting there when, and I understood DNA fairly well, but when he presented this idea of this new tool, like Brett talks about these things called SNPs, my eyes kind of glassed over, and I'm like, oh my God, this is a whole new world. But I also knew that it was the greatest hope we could have to try to solve that case. And so, our office and the team was willing to move forward with it. And I'm obviously quite grateful that they did.
Let's give a little more context on the Golden State Killer. How long had the investigation and failed attempts at bringing charges been going on at the point that you got interested in this approach?
This is where I think it gets fascinating when you look at the numbers, because, we've got now the data, like how long did it take to solve it? So the case went on for 43 years. It had about 600 plus investigators assigned to it over the years. There was 15 different law enforcement agencies involved in that investigation because of the magnitude of the case. Probably close to $10 million was spent to try to solve it. Hundreds of thousands of hours were put into solving it. 8,000 people were looked at as potential people of interest. 300 people had their DNA swabbed and were all eliminated. And that really ultimately produced nothing. And then comes along this new amazing tool called FIG, or investigative genetic genealogy. And it was a team of about 6 people. This is on the Golden State Killer. It cost a few $100s at the time. And the case was solved in 63 days. So you go from 43 years of relentless pursuit of justice by incredible law enforcement to 63 days. It's really powerful.
Okay, so I want to try to give listeners, as much as possible, sort of the sequence, then no pun intended, of exactly what you were doing during this really compressed period where you're solving the case. So I take it at this point, you always knew you had DNA of the murderer. Is that correct?
Yes. So back in the mid 90s, and just to remind the listeners, the Golden State Killer killed, as far as we know, 13 people. He pled guilty to that. He raped upwards of 50 different people over those 43 years. There was direct victims of totaling of well over 80 victims of Golden State Killer. So the magnitude was enormous. So then when this idea was kind of hatched in the fall of 2017, and this little small team was formed, and just to be fair, I wasn't part of that little team. I'm talking about the people that were actually doing the work. 2 people from the FBI, 2 people from the Sacramento DA's office, a genetic genealogist named Barbara Ray Ventnor, and Paul Holes. And so, yes, we had DNA. In the mid 90s, the cases were linked. And then over time, more and more cases were linked by DNA. And the Northern California rapes were linked to the Southern California murders in 2001. And that's when everybody kind of had, 21 years ago, this kind of aha moment that, oh my God, we have one of the worst serial killers and rapists of all time. So that's kind of where we were. We knew we had DNA. Fortunately, there was more DNA to be able to do this type of testing. And if we hadn't had that extra sample that was collected in one of the murders, then perhaps we wouldn't be sitting here today talking about this great case.
Okay, so what happens as a practical matter then once you decide to use this technology? You have the DNA, you now understand the potential for the technology. What's the next step?
Well, I can answer that, or if Brett wants to. I mean, for the purposes of the Golden State Killer, or any of the cases that have been solved since then, I mean, you have to get your sample. You have to have some biological fluid. You then send it out to a private lab at this point, and hopefully soon some public labs. And they do this specialized kind of testing called SNP testing, which gives you incredible amounts of data. And then from there, you're going to utilize a database such as GEDmatch to try to you're uploading it, then you're going to try to build your family trees and identify relatives of your bad guy, basically. Am I right on that, Brett? Hopefully I didn't butcher that too
right
much.
That's exactly right. The way to think about SNPs, or single nucleotide polymorphisms, is we share 99.7% of our DNA. That 0.3% is what differentiates us. And we use that to determine how much DNA you share with others. And that's the whole premise of genetic genealogy. And just to get into the details, but Anne-Marie's right. You then use that information to build a family tree and identify the bad guy.
Anne-Marie, was the murderer, was he a suspect already at this point?
Golden State Killer? Oh no, yeah. He was, he was never on any list. I mean, trust me when I say that for 40 plus years, law enforcement made every list known to man to try to identify this person. And he was never on this list. And that, I think, is what's somewhat fascinating. Now, post Golden State Killer, we've got probably close to 200 at least across the country. Many of the people that have been identified in cases across the country were never on lists. Some were just living right amongst us and just, they woke up one day, decided to kill, and went back to a, quote unquote, normal life. And that is, to me, some of the fascinating kind of realities of what we're seeing with the power of this technology. I mean, I keep saying this, and it's true. This is the perfect marriage, which will never get divorced, of science and law enforcement. It just is.
So, was he in custody already at that point?
What do you mean?
Was he in custody for other other crimes at that point? Okay.
He was. I mean, as most folks know, he was sadly a police officer at points. And he was ultimately fired as a police officer. And that, at least for me, while I was the DA, that was the aha moment, is when they were building the family trees, when they realized he had been a former police officer and that he'd been busted for stealing dog repellent and a hammer. That was kind of the moment of, oh my God, we got something here. This sounds like something real now.
Yeah. So as a prosecutor, I'm curious. You have now this DNA, and what does that do in terms of your ability to prosecute the case as a practical matter? Because it obviously is going to rely on, theoretically, if you get to a jury, explaining the technology in some way to a jury, right? So what was your reaction?
Actually, no, not to correct you, but I am going to little bit correct you.
Yeah.
So I think it's important that folks understand this is an investigative tool, at least from my perspective. And I think most folks that understand this, it's no different than what we get when we call a CODIS hit, which is a DNA hit to a databank, a felon databank. This is a lead for law enforcement. This is like a tip. And so as a prosecutor, we don't anticipate, or we don't suggest that it even be brought into court. It's just simply giving law enforcement a tip. Then they're going to go get a sample, a direct sample from the person of interest. And then they're going to compare it with kind of the old school STR traditional technology. And that is what goes into court. It's not the genealogy, because that, remember, we're dealing with somewhat of privacy issues. We're trying to maintain privacy in the work that we do and balance that public safety. So if it's not necessary to present in a courtroom, then we shouldn't be.
Yeah, Brian, the way Anne-Marie is absolutely right. The whole process of genetic genealogy begins and ends with an STR profile. There's an STR profile from the crime scene. There's an STR profile from your suspect that's been identified by genealogy, and it's the STR profile that's compared and therefore presented in court, because that's the accepted. From a technology perspective, STR profiling is the key.
Yeah, no, that's super helpful. I'm glad we focused on that. So you get enough from this to get a warrant to go get the sample, in this case, from the Golden State Killer, right? And
well, you said it's okay to get in the weeds, but we don't normally, when you finally figure out somebody through a family tree and you think that person's perhaps your suspect, then typically law enforcement, they can get a warrant, and that's possible. There's other ways, legal ways, such as abandoned DNA, when basically the dude's, goes to the restaurant and leaves his cup behind, or he goes to, a drive-through and throws his trash out or whatever. But that's, in the case of the Golden State Killer, it's public knowledge that law enforcement followed him and got, actually twice, they followed him, once to a Hobby Lobby and got a sample from something that was, lawfully obtained. And then secondly, they did what's called a trash run, and they got his garbage and got his DNA from that.
Fascinating. Okay. So that's one of the most famous examples of using this for cold cases. Let's do an exoneration example. The Ricky Davis case is something you've talked a lot about,
Sure.
Anne-Marie, publicly. Can you tell us what happened in that case?
Sure. So Ricky Davis was a guy that was prosecuted in a neighboring county in Northern California called El Dorado County. In the mid 80s, there was a woman that was brutally stabbed to death named Jane Hilton. And the case went unsolved for a period of time. And then the investigators picked it up and they clued in, or they focused in on Ricky Davis because he was staying, I believe, at the home. He had some of his own issues. And ultimately, they had an informant, the girlfriend at the time of Ricky Davis, who claimed that those two committed the crimes. Ricky Davis always confessed his innocence, always, for decades. He was ultimately convicted despite his profession of innocence. And then after he was convicted, the Northern California Innocence Project came to our office, the Sacramento DA's office, I should say my former office, and asked us to do what's called post-conviction DNA work, meaning, can you look at some of the evidence in the case? Can you see if Ricky Davis is on the evidence? And basically what had happened was the victim, Jane Hilton, had been bitten by one of the perpetrators. And there was a bite mark on her shoulder. And so our laboratory, SAC DA's lab, went meticulously and went through her pajamas and ultimately found DNA on the pajamas that aligned with the bite mark. It was basically probably saliva from the bite mark. And that DNA was not Ricky Davis's. And that became a very big piece of evidence to give him a new trial. And he got a new trial for that. But the question was, well, whose was it? Whose DNA was on that pajamas? Because it could have been Ricky's buddy. It could have been completely somebody separately. So that's when I said to the DA in our office, the DA's office, I said, well, we should be doing genetic genealogy on this because we need to figure out whose it is. Either Ricky Davis is actually innocent or Ricky Davis is still potentially guilty. And so through that genetic genealogy, they identified a different person by the name of Michael Green. And Michael Green was in fact the killer. And Michael Green actually just pled guilty to that case about a month or so ago, maybe 2 months ago now. But the important thing is it's a tool of justice. And for me, yes, as much as I am so proud of the work that was done on the Golden State Killer, I mean, it is the most incredible case. Ricky Davis's case is right up there because this man was actually innocent and spent 15 years in prison for a crime he did not commit. And so I look at this tool through the lens of, yeah, it's great for cold cases. Yeah, it's great for, future cases, but we should be using this same tool if there's an actual claim of innocence. And that's what Ricky Davis demonstrated of the power of that tool.
Amazing example. Okay. So Brett, I'd like to talk about the identifying human remains uses that you're engaging in throughout the world. Give us a little bit of context, with whatever you can, within confidentiality rules of the types of things you're working on.
Yeah. So it's a broad, unidentified human remains covers a broad swath of the world, but so GEDmatch, back here in the US, it's routinely used to identify unidentified human remains that are found, right? Using GEDmatch, using the database just like you're identifying perpetrators of crimes, you can also now take a sample from that unidentified human remains and then build trees and identify the person. The other topic we talked about was these conflict zone resolution, resolving the unidentified human remains from conflict zones. There, it's a little different. We're still using the platform SNPs, But actually, because you have known references now, usually, family members will come forward and go, hey, I'm missing a loved one. I want to give a DNA sample. So there we use the GEDmatch infrastructure and tools, but we're actually comparing the unidentified remains to directly a reference database. So it's a separate application, but it relies on the SNP profiling technology that we use for perpetrators or exonerations. But it's just a little different in that we're not comparing those profiles to the main GEDmatch database. These are specific databases generated for each of those conflict zones because they have known references.
So who is your customer typically for that type of work?
So for that, it's the governments of a particular country. So, for example, in Korea, there's the Korean government is working specifically. Spain just changed their laws to be able to exhume the Spanish Civil War remains. So these are government level, high level activities at the government that the government then funds particular labs in that country to do the work. Mexico, similar story as well. In Mexico, it's horrific. They've lost more people now than the Afghanistan, than anybody compared to, like, for example, in the Afghanistan war, they've lost more people than the Afghans had during that period of time. They have over 100,000 people reported missing. They have about 40,000 bodies in crypts. They know they've got about another 60 they haven't dug up. So there's this huge, it is an epidemic, and it's a silent one. It's it's not really talked about. But for us, this is an area where we think the technology can be used to bring closure for all of these families with missing loved ones.
And is the U.S. government currently a client in this regard?
So they are funding certain activities. For example, the U.S. State Department funded the Colombia government to particularly the FARC insurrection down there. There's a number of missing unidentified human remains, and that is State Department funded, and we supplied the technology for that. So yes, the government usually does that. The State Department is funds in certain instances, the other governments.
So we've talked about cold cases, we've talked about exoneration, we've talked about some of the unidentified human remains instances, but my understanding, this is also being used for active prosecutions, right? So yeah, Brett, how do you use the tools in that context?
It's very similar to what Anne-Marie described. In fact, it's dead the same as what Anne-Marie described for the Golden State Killers. Because the first case that was solved using the technology was a cold case, it's not, and I think that's the point, what we've hopefully got out of this podcast is it's not a cold case technology only. It can be used for exonerations or unidentified human remains, but also for active cases, particularly where you get a no-hit on the CODIS database. Reflexing to FIG for violent crime, it should be part of the standard operating procedure in our mind.
Yeah, and let's talk a little bit more about how the government and crime labs can make that more of the standard operating procedure. Tell me how law enforcement is able to access it in that case as a practical matter currently in California.
So let's assume hypothetically they send it to their own crime lab, public laboratory. They get the DNA extracted, meaning that they take whatever the crime scene sample is, they get the DNA out of it, and then they send it off. I assume they did a traditional type of what Brett's calling STR testing. And then they're going to send it to a private lab, probably Bodie. And then they get what's called the SNP testing done. And then from there, it's just like the GSK or any of these other cases, it goes in through the tree building process, and then they figure out from there. So it's exactly the same. The one thing I would say, and maybe this kind of gets a little bit, somewhat of me on my platform is, if we have, let's say we have a rape that happens today, a forcible rape of a child, okay? And we, in law enforcement, have that child or that victim go through a sexual assault examination. It's probably one of the most invasive, personally intrusive types of things we can expect somebody to go through. And that's because we have to collect the evidence. Law enforcement has to collect it. So my view is, listen, that rape happened today, and they've developed a DNA profile, but they can't match it to anybody in the felon database. We owe it to society, and we owe it to that child and to that family and to our communities. We owe it to take that next step. We have the tools. It's here. It's right in front of us. We should avail ourselves every single time of that tool if we're not able to solve it through traditional means.
Right.
And what's holding us back from doing that at bigger scale? Let's start with California, and then I want to ask you the same question nationally. But as a practical matter in California, what's holding us back from doing that in every case?
I think it's two-part, and I'll let Brett chime in, but I mean, maybe more than two parts. I think the first one is raising awareness across the country, across the state. The Golden State Killer happened, was solved over 4.5 years ago. And in many ways, we've come a very long way. But in other ways, we still have a ways to go because we have to get ourselves to the point where it is the norm. And so people understanding it is part of that. And then the second part is that it needs to be part of everybody's budget, just period. It just needs to be, if we think about the power of this tool, and I go back to that San Bernardino case and recognizing that case is still pending. So I'm respectful of that. But if we have the ability to do this in active cases, we have the ability to eliminate the word serial from serial rapes, serial murders. And other folks have said that it's true. So we're not only identifying the guilty, exonerating the innocent, we're preventing future crime. And that's what we need to be in the business of on every single case moving forward.
And Brian, I would agree wholeheartedly with Anne-Marie. It is about awareness, it is about budget, and it's about priority. Because in these labs, for example, COVID caused a huge backlog within these labs. They shut down over COVID and they're digging out of that. And it's about getting the priority of the lab to do the validation and the implementation within the quality standards that they operate within. So it is a number of things, that sort of are slowing, the adoption. This really, the technology is available, it's proven, and it really is a matter of awareness, funding, and prioritization within the law enforcement community.
And in terms of funding, I mean, some of the examples you're talking about of cases pending for 43 years, clearly the money that's spent is giving you, returns by orders of magnitude with modest amounts of funding versus what it's costing to both have the crime itself, but also these,
right,
multi-decade prosecutions, right? I mean, how do you think about the real costs when you make this pitch to folks?
If you think about the cost of doing, the SNP work, doing the genealogy, identifying your potential suspect, you're talking less than $7,500, maybe $10,000, depending on what technology you use, somewhere around there. It could be a little bit more, but you're talking about a $10,000 cost, which is going to give you leads to solve a case. If you compare that to a cold case that you have no known leads anymore, you've exhausted all of your probative leads, then suddenly, that versus the recidivism cost of not doing anything here, it doesn't seem like a large outlay in my mind from that side of it.
I think it's important that, and again, it kind of goes back to my little soapbox, is we're dealing with human tragedy. We're dealing with the human toll of crime. And there is a cost to that, not just the emotional cost, financial cost. I mean, I think about the Golden State Killer and the 83 victims, direct victims that he had. And when I sat in a courtroom and listened to their families tell the judge the impact, I mean, people changed their lives. They changed how they raised their children. They changed the jobs they chose to have as a profession. They changed how they protected themselves in their homes. And so when we talk about this tool, and yes, maybe it costs $7,500 to $10,000, okay, but the human toll of crime, that cost is immeasurable. That's a cost we can never measure because it's so long term. And so I think this, to me, is the return on investment is not just about solving that crime, but it's about really the future for all of us.
And a statistic for you, I think in 2016, the estimated cost of recidivism, it was about $296 billion in the US alone. That's what Anne-Marie's talking about. There is all of these ancillary costs associated with crime that people don't look at. It's real. And the cost to, this new technology, yes, it's more expensive, but it's also been proven that it works. When you look at the US alone, the problem with CODIS is it's STR based, and therefore, depending on the case and the locality in the country, the probability of getting a hit when you upload to CODIS is roughly about 40% on average, and that's if you leave it there for a while, the profile. And so that means 60% of the time you're getting a no hit. And when you think about that and you think about the number of cold cases, there's an estimated number of we think about 100,000 cold case homicides in the US with DNA. There's more cold case homicides than that, but the number with DNA is around 100,000. You have nearly 650,000 sexual assault kits with DNA that are cold cases at this point, and it's increasing, right? Every year, it's increasing at about 100,000 per year, and this is where either you accept that as a society, or you determine that it's worth spending these dollars to actually drive down that cost of crime, right? If it's costing us about $296 billion back in 2016, it's going to cost you more today. It makes sense to be, thinking about your prioritization of where you want to spend, your dollars here.
And in terms of those funding streams, I mean, the U.S. federal system is not totally unique, but it's a little more pointed than some other countries. So how do you all think about the way this really should be funded? Is this something the federal government needs to step up more? Should this be left to the states and municipalities? Does it need to be a combination? What do you think the right mix is here?
Oh, I think it should be a combination. The federal government is, through the NIJ, is the biggest funder of forensics in the US. And it's actually, the US is very unique globally in that it's a centralized funding body for all of the justice system out there, versus in Europe, it's very piecemeal. For example, there's no centralized funding in the EU. And so the government, though, needs to readjust their grant mechanisms to allow funding for this. A year or so ago, it was you weren't allowed to actually put in a grant for example, a SIVA grant. You weren't allowed to put in that you wanted to use it for forensic investigative genetic genealogy. We had a number of customers that had their grants declined. That's an example of where the government funding bodies needs to, be abreast of the technology, being a driver for this. That will actually drive adoption, particularly takes care of the budget. We talked about awareness, and we're working on that with Anne-Marie. But there's the budgeting side, which is very government, that's central federal government focused, where a lot of that money comes from. That can be a huge source of driving both the awareness and also then the jurisdictions to adopt the technology, particularly these public labs, because there's no reason why it should be outsourced. They should be doing this in-house.
And what public labs do we have in California?
Oh, there's quite a number of public labs. I think there's at least 10 public DNA labs, I believe. Is that right?
Okay. There's a lot. I mean, there's California Department of Justice has, I think they have 13 labs, but then there's like Sacramento County DA's office has its own lab. There's several law enforcement labs, LA, LAPD, LASO. So there's a lot of public labs. Kern County, which may well be one of the first, if I can say that and not get chopped and cut out and edited out. But
Northern California, so that might be a problem.
So I just think it's I think the other thing to kind of emphasize this. I've been to a lot of conferences in the last 6 months to a year on genealogy. This is the hottest topic. It's not just conferences on genealogy. It's forensic science conferences. I had the fortune of going to internationally to talk about the Golden State Killer. This is it. You can tell it's finally hit people that this is it. This is the new tool. And now we all have to get on board and do the work that needs to do to bring it in-house and make it the standard.
Yeah. I would agree. I think the awareness, we've reached, that sort of critical point on the awareness side. It's becoming, as Anne-Marie says, it is very much the key focus in a lot of these forensic meetings right now. And really what it is now is about budget and prioritization, is getting the budget and getting it prioritized in their, to implement it in their lab.
And for people who are listening who are not in the law enforcement community or maybe don't work for government in terms of ability to impact funding, but I take it as something really important everybody can do regardless of where you sit in this space, right? And that's opting into these databases. So how does that work, and where can people do that if they want to do that opt-in?
Yeah, the interesting thing about genetic genealogy, and this is what its real power is, with STR profiling, it's usually 1-to-1, maybe 1-to-2. In other words, one profile, you can identify a profile from 1 or 2 people, for example, if you've got a first-degree relative. But with genetic genealogy, its power is it's a 1-to-30, 1-to-40. In other words, you can, from one unknown profile, you will have relatives of 30 or 40 different people potentially in the database. And the sort of standing maths, the way it works is if you have about 1% of the population in the database, you can actually identify 90% of the population to third cousin or closer, or 60% of the population second cousin or closer. The thing is, in the US, we've got about 350 million people-ish. So about 35, you want about 3.5 million people in the database. Today, about 40 million people have taken this test at a genealogy test, whether it be an Ancestry, 23andMe, or MyHeritage, or the like. So we need about 10% of them actually uploading those profiles to either GEDmatch or FDDNA, and opting in to allow law enforcement to, match against that profile to help, identify these perpetrators or unidentified human remains. And so that's really what it is, that we actually have the number of people in the US today who've taken the test to make this, to solve virtually all of these cases that we have. We need them to upload them, and then we need them to opt in, because we don't force people to allow their profile to be used for law enforcement. It's really interesting. We see about 75% of the people who are new to GEDmatch, for example, will opt in to allow law enforcement to match against their profile. It's we see a large number of the people have that sort of civic mindedness to them, and they have no problem allowing that for law enforcement use.
So what's the website where people can go to do that?
So gedmatch.com. So it's you can sign up. You'll have to download your profile from wherever you took your test, 23andMe, Ancestry. We have instructions on the website. It's uploaded. You select your privacy settings, and there you don't have to do anything else at that point.
And I say this to both of you. What didn't I ask you that you should have? I mean, I could keep you for another hour, but I want to be respectful of both your times, because clearly you're working on such important things here. But what didn't we cover that we should have?
I think the only thing for me is, listen, we are in, I like to believe, the greatest revolution in forensic science. Most labs in this country and internationally are still using, basically, as my friends would say, a 30-year-old car. And we need to drive the newest car that we can to solve these problems. And so for me, being part of this effort is so rewarding, because ultimately it's not just about crime solving and exonerations, it's about crime prevention.
No, I think you're absolutely right, Anne-Marie. It's the standard technology in forensic labs today is from, actually, when Anne-Marie said 1994. It's still the same, but the world has moved on. We make life and death decisions in diagnostics based on next-gen sequencing. And, it's time for us to start making those and using the technology for the appropriate decisions in the law enforcement side as well.
Well, it's such an important topic. I was having a conversation with a policymaker in Sacramento recently, and they were sort of saying, what's next in tech? What's really happening? Because it feels like all we're doing right now is, making cameras better on our phones, and like what's actually changing. And to me, it's this and biotech and health. And I think we've had just enormous advances during COVID. One of the very few upsides of COVID is the things that have gone on with gene editing and CRISPR and all these technologies. And so, this whole space is something we want to keep talking about on the show and help keep answering that question of, what's the next stage of tech? Where are we headed? And I can't think of a more important application for society here. So thanks, first of all, for what you're working on. Thanks for being on the show today. If people want to find out more about the company generally, Brett, where should they go?
You can go to verogen.com. That's verogen.com. That'll explain about the company. It also has links there to GEDmatch. GEDmatch is the other part of Verogen, which is both for, the law enforcement and the consumer side as well.
And Anne-Marie, now that you are out of office, where can people find you online?
I have my own company called Schubert Strategies. So, stay tuned. The website will be up, I'm sure, soon, but or you can find me, just probably Google.
Well, Brett and Anne-Marie, thank you so much for being on the show today. Thanks for what you're working on. This is such a hugely important topic, and we hope to have you back on to keep talking about this issue as we move forward.
Appreciate it, Brian.
Thanks for having us. For the listeners out there, I hope you keep listening to these podcasts. You can find us on InsideCrimeFiles.com and listen to more about the true consequences of crime and the innovation and inspiration that comes out of these cases. So I just thank you all.
OLAS Media presents Inside the Crime Files. OLAS Media.